How do you reflect and think deeply when it matters most? The importance of this question for me emerged during the first COVID lockdown. The world had just been sent into lockdown by state governments, first in Southeast Asia, then Europe, then North America, followed by us in New Zealand. Within the church space, the conversation about what pastors should do was quick and decisive. We need to broadcast church online, is what people said. So we did it. Some churches elected for a congregational Sunday morning Zoom call, others for a live broadcast from their living room with their children as the worship team, while others, like myself, pre-recorded individual elements at home between various pastors and leaders and broadcasted the service, quote-unquote, live on Sunday morning. We did this on and off for about a year and a half whenever we needed to. Now, I know what you're thinking. I don't want to hear about COVID lockdowns in church again. I want to move on. Don't worry. We're going to talk about something way more important than that. During and following the COVID lockdowns, almost every pastor I talked to knew the church had been found out for relying too heavily on Sunday morning gatherings for discipleship, and not enough on individual discipleship and resilience. But many of us didn't know where to go to think through and reflect on change. So as the country opened up, things quickly went back to the way they once were, and our moment for theological reflection had passed. This is a case study we may revisit later in this conversation, but it typifies a more important question. How do we think biblically and theologically about critical moments in critical incidents and at critical times? Do we just go with our gut, what the popular churches or Christians are doing, the latest technological fad, or do we make an informed decision? Well, how do we make biblical and theologically informed decisions? That's what we'll explore today. Kia ora koutou, welcome to Lunch on the Way. I'm Joey Millington, joined as always by Graeme, and Jonathan has had a string of meetings today.
A string of meetings.
Can't make it.
Well, this is church, isn't it?
It is. It's just one meeting after the other. That's life.
And you got to do it when you got to do it. So
yeah.
We missed you, Jonathan.
Yeah, we do. We miss you.
I look forward to having you back next time.
Next time, hopefully next week.
Yeah.
So, Graeme, this is a conversation we weren't expecting to get into today because we're saving another one for Jonathan.
Yeah.
But we're talking about how do we think well within a biblical and theological framework, not just when you have a lot of time to think, but even during these critical moments and incidents that happen in life, and they range from, as I not only alluded to but made explicit, the COVID lockdowns. That was a critical incident where churches and people just had to quickly react because we were going into lockdown on, say, Thursday, and Sunday morning was still coming. So what do? Not a lot of time for reflection. But this happens on numerous occasions. So, for example, there's the slow progress of change, or movement of change, where maybe your local demographics are changing, and that's a critical incident that you don't necessarily see immediately, but you see over time. And how do we think theologically and biblically about how to reach different types of people that we weren't previously reaching 10 or 15 or 20 years ago? And what is the cultural and contextual makeup of our community? Do we just go with our gut reactions? Do we just go with what we ought to do, or do we? How do we do that?
It's a really good question because recently when I was in the US, I was talking with my cousin-in-law and cousin. They're another 10 years on me, but I've been in pastoral ministry and theological education. And I think one of the comments was, we don't critically think. And I thought, actually, you're quite right. So what do we mean by critically think?
What do we mean by that?
Well, critical think is, I think, is the ability to sit, you have something in front of you, and it's to step back and ask really critical questions, the questions that actually scrutinize your assumptions.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is the thing, in the notion of theological reflection, one out is that all of us live with an embedded theology. So when we're going to church, there's an embedded theology within that church, and most often we're not thinking about that. It's the default setting. Oh, of course we believe that. And we could go through a range of things, but that would be default settings. But I don't necessarily want to, because I don't want to upset the audience by bringing into
No, we
question
won't
some
get
things,
into particulars.
things.
Yeah.
But it'd be things that a particular tradition or church denomination will hold, and of course that's what you think.
Yeah.
Critical thinking is the ability to sort of actually, why do we think that? Where did that come from? Mm-hmm. Is that true?
Yeah.
How does that stack up biblically? Is it consistent within the biblical narrative? And what's the hermeneutic around that? So there's lots of questions we can bring to that. Mm-hmm. That then, this is what I would call sort of pushes into a space of critical thinking. Ability to have something, but then step back from that and ask the questions.
Because from this whole idea of critical thinking and theological reflection is what we're really talking about, theological reflection. I've never called it that. I called it more just thinking through the process, or I didn't have a name for it until I really came here and interacted with yourself and some other people and Jonathan about how to have a framework of thinking that allows you to change your action, and not just change your action based on a gut reaction or based on an assumption or a pull in a particular direction, but to base that assumption, change that action based on informed decisions. So, to be completely honest, prior to moving to New Zealand, coming from an East Coast Canadian context, I didn't think theologically well, if that makes sense.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I'll give you my narrative on theological. Theological reflection is actually a discipline, and it emerges really in terms of, so what it does, it takes experience, and it suggests that experience is actually quite important in the human human experience. I'm using experience again, but actually what we experience is hugely important in terms of our theological framing and our understanding. So it sort of comes out of liberation theology in South America.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where
Does it really?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
It does.
Wow.
And then it sort of develops in the 90s, but it's developed into, it is a particular discipline. And so there are tens of models of theological reflection, models of the way in which to process. So it might be you have this experience, and then you go, well, how do I process that experience? So, a model would be actually taking that through a particular process, maybe. Well, for example, what was the experience? Mm-hmm. Oh, it was this. And then the next part of the model might be, and one they're roughly kind of the same, would be, well, what did I feel in that experience? What were all the emotions? What were the things that were triggering me? What's the story around this? And then you might go to another step of actually going, well, what resources have I got that might inform that experience, all those elements that I've thought about, not just the experience but the feelings.
Yeah.
Where might I go for that? So Scripture becomes really important here, but more widely, theological ideas might be important here. How does our understanding of God fit here? Understanding of Trinity. What's our understanding of church? And then when you pull that into the picture again, there's actually, the way in which I was reacting, this helps explain it. This helps inform that. How might I respond differently next time? Mm-hmm. That's roughly a process of theological reflection. And you apply different models. There's all sorts of different models.
But that's the bare bones of what it looks like.
So my experience was I've always been kind of slightly reflective and always asking questions. So asking questions, and we could talk a little bit about that. So when I was doing my master's, as you do, and I was doing it through Otago University, and you have a suite of master's papers that are available for you here, and I looked at them and I thought, oh gosh, there's nothing really I want to do. I'm going to have to do theological reflection. That was
your thought going
into it.
Yeah,
I thought, I guess I'll have to do this.
Yeah.
Well, it proved to be one of the most important papers I've ever done, because I went into this paper and did this paper, and I'm thinking it gave me a process. It actually crystallized this notion of actually reflection, and there's particular ways to do reflection and theological reflection. Actually, this is really, really helpful. Mm-hmm. And that's where I picked up that. So I kind of fell into it unintentionally.
Yeah.
And then when we came here sort of 14 years ago, we brought that into the internship programs.
Yeah.
And now it's part of actually some of the master stuff.
Yeah. And so my experience is where in the East Coast of Canada, the model and the methodology was just assumed. Where if you were to change anything or to reflect on anything, it wasn't as much around. It wasn't as much around how we do what we do as how do we do what we do more effectively.
Right.
That was the way that reflection happened, at least in the context that I rolled in. And it wasn't until I came here, and honestly, the big kind of critical moment was the COVID lockdown for me. That was really when the shoe dropped, where I realized, oh no, I need to actually have a proper method or model or framework of reflection so I can think biblically and theologically, not only to do what I'm doing better. That wasn't the issue. The issue was, how do we do something new? That was the critical issue, because we realized very quickly, at least my church did, that the Sunday morning service had so much of our resources and time and effort, when even though it is incredibly important, I'm never ever going to dismiss that. It is vitally important, and it should probably have a higher percentage of our resources and effort compared to other areas of ministry. However, we realized that once that was taken out from us, we felt like we were caught out. And I realized quickly, I need to learn how to think so I can change a method, not just change what I'm doing to make it work better.
So you know, so this crisis, and I suggest even partially, you know, for people, life has its various points of crisis. We're having kids, don't get sleep, they get sick, loss of job, a sickness, a death in the family. The kind of ruptures that kind of and so what we've run things have been running quite smoothly. Our theology all works, but then questions are raised. Questions like, why did that happen? Where was God in that? How do I understand that theologically? Now that invites us into a theological reflective space, but I think that's theological reflection as a discipline gives us the tools to do that. So that's where models and what I call intentionality in the process is really important. So some people may be more inclined to this, maybe not, but I actually think it's really important for everybody. So what we do with students here is actually, you do it in the internship, but I certainly do it in other papers, actually press them into that space. They have to do it.
Yeah. And
they come out the other side going, actually, this is quite hard.
Yeah.
But gee, it's kind of revolutionary.
Yeah.
Because and this is the thing I think with theology, that in our Western frame of thinking, theology often, I don't want to be but it often sits in a book.
Yeah.
And the criticism of New Zealand is, theology, you don't need all that sort of stuff. I just need this heart and that. But we're always theologizing, and there's an assumed theology or embodied theology, or not embodied, embedded theology. We're not even realizing what. So being pushed into using a model then actually identifies, what are my assumptions?
Yeah.
Actually, I've got a whole lot of them.
Yeah.
And are those assumptions true?
Yeah.
Do they stack up? Are they actually biblical? Are they theologically consistent? You have a chance to actually look at that. And I think that's really helpful. So there's a sense of theological reflection as a posture, and there's theological reflection actually when we think about it as a discipline and the application of models. Yeah,
exactly. And so when I apply that to what I was processing in 2020, I quickly realized, and this wasn't like I sat down one afternoon and theologically reflected, and I figured it out. Now, this is over the course of many months, probably from about the first lockdown in March all the way to probably October, November of that year. I was really just wrestling.
That's a really good, it's about 6 to 8 months.
About a 6 to 8 months just wrestling and sitting with the realization that the model of ministry, or the ministry philosophy, if you will, that I received was mostly based on pragmatism and mostly based on trends that other larger churches were doing and co-opting. And it's not to say that it's bad that you're doing what other people are doing. In some sense, it's all you really can do to a certain extent. We're kind of copying and innovating off each other. But I realized that in a moment of crisis like COVID, that was really caught out. And I realized that, we need to think about what is the purpose of Sunday morning? Like, what is it? Can it be multiple things? Sure, but what is the purpose? How do I think about that? And then what else does the church need to be about to actually begin to form, to disciple, and to reach people? What does the church need to be about? And these questions, I think we're thinking about them all the time. But there are moments of crisis that require us to think deeply about them.
That's right. So there's there's kind of the surface space. Yeah. And I think that partly what happens is that the pragmatism kicks in. How do I do this better? Yeah. How can we get people to respond better? But we're not getting underneath, which may cause us to ask, well, why do we do that in the first place? Yeah. And there's a deeper press here towards coming back to Scripture and actually asking, and actually doing our theology again. So I actually think there's a place. This runs much deeper to actually, I think, formation and discipleship. So if a church is engaged in evangelism, what is evangelism? Yeah, you can't ask that question, Graeme. It's all assumed. It's this and this. Well, no. Let's just come to that as it's like a second naivety. Let's come. And let's put up what our assumptions are, and together, and then let's come to Scripture again and ask. And so I think that kind of dynamic invites us back into a really good place of imagining, and vitality and life and excitement, because we're re-engaging again. There's a sort of something. I think something happens, and I think discernment's around that as well. Yeah. So you're saying, well, with the church, maybe we need to be discerning this space. What's God saying? That's kind of what I think you were going in. Yeah, no, 100%. I think it's what is God trying to teach us? And this isn't out of the vacuum. I know that one of our first conversations we ever had on this podcast, published conversations we had on this podcast, was about kind of this question of something shifting in the church in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And at that time, I was really sensing that, and not just sensing it intuitively, but having conversations with the pastors and realizing, there's a time, now's the time to think methodologically about why are we doing what we're doing, and can we do things differently, not just try and do what we're already doing better. Because what does better mean? I think there was a posture of openness, because I think people realized once we were opening up again in 2022, we're like, what do we even do? Yeah, what do we, what am I supposed to do? And now fast forward 2 years from then, I've had a conversation with a pastor, and where he's mentioning how he's like, I'm still in that space, Joey. I'm still in that space of I really want to reflect and think deeply, and I really need to question the assumptions that I've had, but I don't want to rock the boat too much, because I know that there's a bunch of other pastors and colleagues I had around me who are just like, please stop it. Let's just move on. I don't want to think about this deeply anymore. And so we're caught in this tension of there's a whole portion of the church that's like, let's just move on. That time has passed. We're back together again. Let's just continue on. But there's another portion where it's like, how do we actually think about this moment that we're in? And has this moment passed? If it hasn't, then what's the process we need to journey on to actually begin to do what we do better, I think differently? If you use COVID sped things up. Yeah. So if it sped things up, what did it speed up? Well, it may have sped up some of the realities that are sitting, the tectonic plates that are sitting underneath. Yeah. May have moved in certain directions faster than we weren't aware of. Yeah. Well, does that mean that when COVID's over, they've stopped moving? No, it doesn't. So no, they're still moving. We're just now blind to them. So what do you mean, Graeme? Well, I mean, put some names to it. Yeah, I mean, Zoomers, millennials going to church, the issues of we've dying churches across the country. Yeah. In certain denominations, and I don't think that's necessarily an opinion. I think the stats tell us. We saw some stats last week. We saw some stats last week. So COVID sped that up. Yeah. somebody said to me yesterday, he works for a mission organisation, was a pastor. He says, a lot of my friends don't go to church now. They're still Christians, they just don't go.
So a part of a missions organization, and they don't go to church?
Well, no, he was saying he's part of a mission organisation now.
Yeah.
And he said that his people he knows and colleagues he knew really well who are involved in church,
I see.
his age, so he's just turned 50, have sort of given up. So, there are questions around why.
Yeah.
Why? What's going on? So it's digging at those sort of questions. Well, why did people just drift out?
Yeah.
And your point about do we put a lot of too much weight on the event?
Yeah.
Well, it's a good question. I'm not going to answer that.
Well, I don't know because
so it's the ability to ask those questions and then with others wrestle with them. Mm-hmm. But that's when you start asking questions, it gets uncomfortable.
It does.
Because then you're kind of raising questions that actually might undermine the kind of premise on which you work on.
Yeah.
And that doesn't feel comfortable.
No, it's not. It's not comfortable. And it's not to say that, like, I think during COVID, a lot of people were thankful for God's leading to allow us to go online and for that to be available. And I think that's absolutely true. But I also think that God's been leading people and churches into a new kind of conceptual space of reassessing what's going on, because I think because of the intense pragmatism, which I get it, we need to do stuff. I get it. We got to do stuff. We're on mission. Our feet are on the ground. Let's move. But sometimes that intense pragmatism can undercut and kind of subvert reflection and thinking. And there's even sometimes a thought that don't think too much.
Yeah. I mean, this could be part of a New Zealand culture. I don't mean don't think too much, but the pragmatism. Mm-hmm. Well, and maybe the notion that thinking is it gets us into trouble. We'll go down a road that we don't want to go down. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. I've always been a person that has asked questions, and on a personal level, probably about 20 years ago, I was really struggling with something wrong with me because I asked all these questions, and
what's wrong with you, Graeme?
To me, Graeme, you asked too many questions. I was told that you asked too many questions, and it was in a process of working with a spiritual director. I realised it was nothing wrong with me. In fact, it was a gift, and I should celebrate that. So. But then the flip side is that why does that make people feel uncomfortable? Because it actually, in some ways, I think unravels or presses on an embedded theology. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That this is what we've always assumed. You always, I can't remember exactly the story about the granddaughter always puts on the oven and does something with the oven, but doesn't know why she does it, and then finally one day finds out, why do you do it this way? Oh, because my grandmother did it this way, and for completely different reasons. It's totally irrelevant now. Yeah, you wouldn't do that now because the things have changed, technology's changed. So, but it required somebody to stand back and ask the question, why do you do it that way? Yeah. So I think there's other things around here too. As I think that the title of this book here, which is not necessarily an easy read.
Put it in front of your face and show it to the camera.
This one here is one that Jonathan was reading when he was doing his PhD, and he recommended it to me, and I read it. Not an easy read, but the title says something, From Theology to Theological Thinking. And he makes the distinction that often, theology is kind of, in one sense, static. Not like kind of the way our Western thing. It sits in a book. I just need to get these ideas right.
Well, there are big pillars of orthodoxy for sure.
Yeah. And I'm not assuming that. Yeah. But the notion of doing theology or theological thinking is we're actually in process, and it's a dynamic rather than something that's static. Yeah. So that's where I think theological reflection is really helpful, because we're asking, not really all the time, but different things that happen to us in our experience. Mm-hmm. So where was God in that? How do I understand that? Is that how we do church? Yeah. All those sort of questions?
And I think, every degree I get, yeah, at some point you should stop and stop, getting degrees. I do understand that. But every degree I get, I think to myself, man, I can't imagine being a pastor without this.
Yeah.
And so with my undergrad, I'm like, wow, I can't imagine being a pastor without this. I'm like, I'm so thankful. And then once I got my master's in theology, I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I was preaching the Bible without this master's, And then now that I did a second one, and I'm like, oh my goodness, now I really understand the book of Romans. And any future education, that's always the process, because I feel like if you don't have at least a framework of understanding, then you can't question the assumptions that you have in front of you, where you just receive the methodology, or you receive the most popular book that's on the bestsellers list in Christian networks around leadership and formation and spirituality, or church governance or whatever, instead of asking the question or having a framework and an education that allows you to be critical. Yeah. The most valuable thing my education has given me is the ability to ask questions.
Yeah, so you learned how to think.
Yeah.
And actually your degrees and the learning will also tell you what you don't know.
Yeah.
So that's
exactly.
So
yeah.
So what don't I know? Actually, I don't know a whole. There's a whole lot I don't know.
Yeah.
So therefore, that then raises the question. So then, well, maybe I need to. So this is not quite black and white.
No.
In fact, it's not black and white. And that's a little bit of my hobby horse too. I get a bit annoyed with, as I've said to you before, like with you watch the kind of interviews that happen in journalism, and you watch the interviews that happen, and you'll hear them say, "Give me a yes or no for this."
I know.
And I'm going, so what's going on there? What's going on there is the assumption is that we're living in a yes-no world. We're not living in a yes-no world. It's nuanced. It's not black and white. It's full of colour. And the colours are different shades of blue, different shades of yellow. So the question is a problem. And that's this sort of very, what I call dialectic sort of assumption, where it's either this or it's that. And I don't think that's helpful.
No.
I think it's really unhelpful. So that kind of what I call not dualism, but it's this sort of
binary.
Binary, the word. Binary thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's either this or it's that. No, it's not.
Yeah, and I guess what I don't want people to be listening and thinking is that we're questioning everything and we're living in this questionable space and state. That's actually not the point of reflection.
No.
The point of reflection is actually there's a moment of uncomfortability of asking the important questions that question the assumptions that we hold within us because of the critical moment or incident that has happened. And then that allows us to then look into, pray, ask God for guidance, do some homework, have conversations with people, and see what new way forward could emerge, or what could I have done differently, and what should I do differently in the future, and then that allows us to then move into a new space.
Exactly. I mean, it's faith pressing forward.
Yeah.
Because what's sitting behind that is I think is the question. It's not just sort of asking questions. It's actually, so what's the space of asking that questions, or what's my lovely word of ecology? Mm-hmm. What's the framing of that? It's faith pressing forward.
Yeah.
It's sort of those sort of questions. How then might I live? If Christ is real, and yes, and I believe this, and I've experienced God, then how should I live? What does this mean? And I think that's the question that's leaning forward, rather than the kind of questions that's trying to actually dismantle everything.
Yeah.
Because that's actually not helpful.
No, it's not helpful at all. And so my reflections and questions about Sunday morning in particular, what they've actually done is reinstantiate the importance of Sunday morning within my thinking, but reinstantiates it in a more nuanced way, to where myself as a leader in the things that I do and how I preach and what I say, and even the orders of service that I want to emphasize now have shifted slightly.
So tell me, how has Sunday morning changed for you since as an exercise of theological reflection, you just said sort of 6 to 8 months. So what changed in that? How you saw church?
Well, what changed for me, and this is not comprehensive, but what's changed in my thinking is in a contrast to online church, because that was the big moment of, okay, we're all online. What's actually with online church? I know it's different. I know it's not the same thing. How is it not the same thing? And when we get back together, what are the things about the gathered people of God that I really want to emphasize and really want to drive home?
So what were those things?
So those things were honestly moments of response. Like, this is nothing new, but it just further, it gives me reasons, it gives me the why behind why I do what I do. So moments of response, not just responses in like reflection in the mind, but responses in like, do you need prayer? Let's pray together.
Okay, so and was that something about? So you can do that online.
Well, you can do that online, but there's something about somebody being next to you, putting their hand on your shoulder, on their shoulder, and praying with them, and specifically praying for God to show up.
Okay, so there's something about the body.
Yeah, something about the body, the incarnational aspect of who we are.
Yeah, right. So now we're getting
right, and so I know on the online space, sure, God can use fiber optic cables and get through space like that. I understand that, but there's something about being embodied that matters a whole lot. And then to further that on, I realized, man, who am I? Who am I to be communicating the Word of God? Because I'm just like, when I was doing it in front of a camera at home, I'm just like, man, I just feel like I'm speaking for God right now. I'm like, this is crazy. I'm like, I'm telling you what God thinks. Yes, I'm telling you what God thinks based on His scriptures. But if I'm doing that, I really need to know what God said. Like, I really need to know.
So how does that change when you're in the church doing that? Where real bodies is in place, as to opposed to being on camera.
Well, on the camera, I had to be way more charismatic.
Oh, so you had to be. You felt you had to perform.
It was more performative.
And and then well, I'm questioning you because it's pushing you. So, so you're on. So the camera's there. It's recorded, and now
hit lights, camera,
broadcast
action.
At some other point.
Yeah.
So what's the difference to that where you are doing that live?
The people in the moment responding to the word.
Okay.
That's and even not
so is
just,
place important?
It's place is important because it's not even about. It's not an ego thing of like, people are really into what I'm saying. Okay. No, it's not about that. And it's not even about a response at the end of the word. It was a moment where you could literally sense that the word being spoken was sowing seeds in good soil, or in, if we want to use that metaphor that Jesus used. And people, you could actually, like, if you were preaching, if what you were preaching was connecting, you could immediately see that. And because of that, you could even sense where people were at, and you could respond accordingly, and then you could invite people to respond accordingly. Like, that dynamic was completely lost, and it just felt like I was talking to no one.
So so the question, when you start thinking about that, and we start wrestling with that, what pops up for me and what I begin to hear, and underneath that is actually place is important. The actual spatial place is important. And time is important.
Yeah.
So, the question is then going, so how do we think about that theologically? And then you also mentioned incarnation, being bodied in the space. So all those things start opening up the space to think, don't they?
Yeah. And also...
which really starts to think, you start to think theologically, you go, so what was Jesus really talking about in John 1? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. What does that actually mean?
Yeah.
It throws it into a different light when you start asking those questions.
100%. And it also makes me realize, like, that's just what I contribute in the service. I don't, like, the worship band, if you will, or the praise team, or whatever word you want to use, like, that is self-evidently important.
Yeah.
Because of the embodiment of praise, if you will, in the space, in a location with people, is powerful. And it doesn't really matter. Like, to be honest, it online is not the same, because what I noticed online was it was an individualization of of the service, whereas the service was for you, Graeme, to receive and to, if you will, consume. And this is a product packaged for you. And that's it. I think that was actually inherent within the medium itself. We might not.
That's right.
You know, I don't think that is an assumption that we just carry along with it. I think it's inherent in what it is. And so when we're actually gathered together, and you know, we're having conversations before the service, I'm talking to people, and then the service begins, and then the service ends, and then we're in conversation with people. Maybe we're having moments of prayer together or encouraging one another, like that. That immediately, that medium just demonstrates to me that it's not for me, you know?
So the spatial environment is communicating much more. So like if you recorded you and did an excellent sermon and produced it really well on the screen, and then I watch it at a later time, but I might be watching when I'm in the you know, I'm lying on the couch.
On the toilet?
well, yeah, I mean, I could be, but it's not. So what you're saying actually, that I'm getting something, but I'm not getting the full the spatial elements of what that is, which is everybody else is present too. Yeah, there's a sense of God at work in time. So I mean, all those sort of things. So theological reflection. See, as you're doing that, it's unpacking all sorts of stuff. Yeah, isn't it? I mean, imagine you're in a conversation with others.
This is just over the last 20 minutes.
Yeah,
you know?
and you start unpacking that with others. So how is important? What's going on when we're all together?
Yeah, and then so what that has done to me is these are assumptions I've already had because I already didn't prefer online as an option, even though in my previous church I had created that process for the church, and in this church I'm in, I had created that process for this church. I was highly critical of it. Not that it's not important. Yeah, if people need to be connected in some way to what's happening, and this is our gathering, and online space works, that's great. But it's not to replace. It's not a replacement by any means. Like it is a shadow of the true thing. You know, of the actual being together in a physical.
Reminds
space.
Me actually. I'm pretty sure it's second epistle of John, where I think John says to who he's writing to is. Look, bring the letters, but actually far more that you're in person. Something along those lines.
Letters are online church.
So, you know, when you're in this conversation, theological reflection might say, do you know, we should have a look at that text and do some thinking about that. What was John really saying? What was going on there? Books are really important. Letters are really important. They're carrying communication. Yeah. But obviously something more about the body and being in a space at a certain time was somehow important here. Yeah. It's not obvious to me. We should talk about that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So I think, you know, when we start talking about theological reflection, it's in the numerous books that I have, you know, and with students talk about is theological reflection as we do it individually, but I actually think it's a practice that we should do in church, you know, as part of discernment. Yeah. You know, and how much would that kind of enliven our what I call sort of almost sort of ho-hum with Scripture. Oh, yes, I've read that so many times. I've heard that sermon so many times. It's just not alive to me anymore. And we sit there like this. But if we were to kind of then engage with our experience, opening up the text, and with some theological tools, wow, is that what they thought then? You know, how does that work now? So I think then we've got a dynamic live conversation, and I think, to be honest, I think that's what people. Well, is that an assumption? I mean, I've had some people say to me, when I was pastoring, Graeme, I didn't come to church to think. I've had that comment passed to me. Yeah. And I think, well, maybe I need to sort of, you know, bring it back a bit. But the flip side of that is, well, hang on a second. Part of you being a human being is that you do think. No. And part of being Christian is that you're not going to grow unless you do.
But what that person just said, I didn't come to think. I'm not. I understand that. Yeah. I really understand it. Yeah. Because sometimes I show up in a space wanting to feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And that's completely okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes I show up and I'm like, I'm ready for my mind to be changed and for God to transform my mind and renew it. I really am. But sometimes I just need a hug from God. And that's all I need.
And you know, maybe that's when we think about churches where, I mean, you know how I've kind of played on the thing of making or poesis. Yeah. And I like the word because it's sort of, I think that the notion of the idea sits somewhere between thinking and doing.
Mm-hmm.
We're always making.
Mm-hmm.
So, so the question is, what are we making and how are we making it?
Yeah.
So how are we making our faith? Which then in a service would ask, well, maybe that's the prayer that's said, the song that's sung, the person giving out if they are, because I'm not sure that we are even doing that now, the communion or the Eucharist, the handshake at the door, the conversation at the table after the service. It's all part of, but I don't think we think about that.
No. And
so those are all, that's the hug from, could be, any one of those moments could be a hug from God.
Yeah. I think, 100%. I think you're right.
So it's all forming us.
Yeah, it is.
And we're making ourselves in the space.
It's all forming us. And I think what I realize after I go through processes of theological reflection after a critical moment or incident like COVID, for example, I realize that what theological reflection actually does is it's mostly a reminder. It reminds me of the things the church has always done, but it provides with me a new why behind it. A why that is contextual, a why that is for me and my community, and a why that makes sense in this space and this time right now. Because what happens throughout time is that why gets left behind with the previous generation. And then the new generation receives the tradition without a why. And then we dismantle it because it's like the fence that we don't know why it's there. And no one wants to ask why. They just want to get rid of it because it's a little bit cumbersome, right? So all the things that I mentioned to you about what I've been thinking about around Sunday morning as a result of COVID, none of that is new. Absolutely none.
No.
It's just provided because of the contrast we have with technology. It has a new why for me.
Yeah.
And because of that, I can actually live more, I guess, convictionally in that space of gathered community because I now realize why this is optimal compared to anything else.
So, I mean, theological reflection is not something new. You're quite right. I don't think it's something new, although, as a discipline, it emerges and is languaged probably from the 90s.
Well, not the discipline itself; it's the things that the discipline uncovers.
Yeah.
Are not.
No, that's right. And the idea of sort of reflection. Again, it's interesting. Here's the line. All theology is worship.
Yeah.
How does that relate? Well, doing this, what you're doing, is deeply integrated. I mean, and that's what you're after. Actually, is not just sort of a theological idea or embedded theology here, and me living or I'm living here. It's actually integrating that world. How do I fit those experiential pieces that really kind of rupture something? How do I actually integrate that into a kind of lived faith? I think that's what theological reflection does.
Yeah, and we're talking about the macro a little bit, if you will, about what involves more than just you. But what theological reflection should involve just you. So, for example, many people in the millennial generation had what people call deconstruction.
Yeah,
deconstructed their faith. That's a moment of crisis that requires theological reflection, and then an instantiation of this new why behind why you do what you do, because you've received the tradition of your parents. You're trying to realize it for yourself. It doesn't make sense compared to competing worldviews. You look into it deeply. You pray. You ask God for guidance. You have conversations with people, and then you have a new why. If you emerge in a positive direction.
Yeah.
However,
was there a tipping point with somebody, with some, so person grows up, I mean, they say this, people that grow up, go into youth group, faith's happening for them, they go off to university at 18, 19, and then they lose their faith.
Yeah.
So, so the question is, through that process of losing their faith, were there people around where the questions they needed to ask, they couldn't ask?
Yeah, well, exactly.
Were there other people there? So the people that now they're asking those questions not in a faith community anymore.
Yeah,
they're asking it in a kind of very secular, postmodern deconstructionist sort of approach.
Yeah.
And then they lose their faith.
Well,
so, which would say to me, we're not doing a very good job as a church.
Well, you know what's very interesting about that point? They weren't able to ask questions, and that actually aligns exactly with the research. So I remember back in, I think, 2014, 2013, Barna had come out with a study about that exact question of why young adults are losing their faith once they leave youth group and go off to university. And for those who didn't lose their faith, well, a common denominator amongst all the samples in the group was that they were able at a young age to ask questions. It's not that they received answers to those questions.
No.
It's that they were able to ask questions and realize that not everything is black and white, and there's some gray area in life, and that discipleship and following God is a journey, not a destination.
Yep.
And it was through being able to ask questions to older people in particular, that they realized, oh, I can, I don't need to have everything together.
Yeah.
You know, and that was enough for them to hold on to their faith.
Yeah.
Oddly enough.
Yeah, and I wonder whether it's, again, I'm sort of pushing over a bit all over the place, but I wonder sometimes, in a Western culture, because we live in a kind of quite a mechanical framed world, so causes and effects, you have a cause, you have an effect, and because of that, we're not open to mystery. I don't mean necessarily mysticism, but mystery. So in other words, we've got to have an answer for everything.
Yeah.
When in actual fact,
no,
it's actually quite a good place to be.
Yeah.
To say, and that's where I'd say, well, actually there are things about God. I mean, in Eastern Orthodox tradition, they have, now you'll probably remember the words of these better than I do, where there's two kind of words. One, we can say positively about God what we know, but then there's a sort of theological frame that says actually we actually say what we don't know about God.
Okay, this is news to me. Yeah.
Apathetic or something like that.
I've heard of those terms. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a sort of so Eastern Orthodox will say, well, we can say this about God, but actually we can't. So they throw it into the thing. We can't say this.
So it's in the mystery category.
Yeah. So I think this is that actually, which raises the question. Actually, there's mystery here.
Yeah.
We cannot know everything about there is to know about God.
No.
And nor should we try. So. Nor should we, maybe just that it's helpful for us to say what we don't know.
And we live in a complicated world. That's the reality post-COVID that I fully realized is how many variables are at play in the community that I'm trying to reach with the church.
Yeah.
And I'm realizing I have, compared to where I came from, contextually speaking, it was quite mono-ethnic, white European, East Coast of Canada. If I mentioned if I said society was secular in East Coast of Canada, I knew what that meant. You either had people who had no contact with church, people who were nominal Christians, people who were Christians, and those are the three categories.
Yeah.
And so we knew how to reach all three people.
Yeah.
But living in Auckland, there's hundreds of different categorizations with cultural assumptions behind it. So when I'm talking about methodology and changing what we do, how we do what we do, that is not an easy question to wrestle with, because it is so difficult. And I think it's okay. I think
so.
It's okay.
Therefore, theology then has to be, the theological thinking then has to be quite contextual.
Yeah.
You have to ask, well, so what's the context? That doesn't mean to say you're giving away, important orthodox ideas, but they engage with the context.
Yeah.
Not just sort of force that context. One's, Calvin, Wesley, Luther, go back before. They're all wrestling with the context.
Yeah, I don't want to get into the particulars, because we'd have a whole conversation around how do you actually what's a good strategy for reaching people? Do you try and be broad and reach everybody, or do you try and be laser focused and reach people who you can most relate to?
Yeah.
How does that reflect your ecclesiology? Are you a multi-ethnic church? Are you a mono-ethnic church? Are you a
well, yeah. I would want to. If we went in that conversation, I'd go, I want to ask the question. So, what do we mean to be human?
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
What does that look like?
Yeah. So, but we won't need to get into that conversation, because that's a whole other podcast episode.
Yeah.
But what would you say to somebody, a pastor right now, who you might be coaching, because you're a coach, who's saying, Graeme, I don't know where to begin I feel like I need to do things differently, not just try and do things better. I need to actually change what I'm doing almost completely. And I not only need to do that, I need to help guide people on that journey as the leader. What would you say to somebody? What would you say?
Well, I'd probably begin to ask them questions about who they are.
Okay.
Who are they? You know, what's their context? What's God put in their hand? And because why would I be asking that question? I'm reminded of, and I really like the story because I think it's a metaphor of wrestling. They need to move into a place of wrestling, learn how to wrestle. And I think the metaphor for that, or biblical story around that one, is the story of Jacob with the angel, because he puts his foot. There's discomfort. He walks out of that with a limp. His name changes. Yeah. So there's something that's really going on there. So I think it's a nice picture or metaphor to say that, so I don't know what's going on. Well, maybe it's beginning to ask just who you are. What's your call? What's your ministry? What's your experience? Because actually that may help you figure out, like learning how to wrestle with who you are. And there's probably likely to be things there that, your experience, then I think that draws us back into the Scripture again. Yeah. And that's what I often do when I'm coaching people. So is there a biblical passage or a kind of story that resonates here with you? And interesting, they'll go, yeah, this one does. So we should think about that. What's going on there for you? So it's drawing them back into the text again, but it's helping them wrestle with that. Because then if they start to do that, then maybe they're going to do it with that. So they have to learn how to do that. Yeah. So that's kind of where I'd start.
That's where you would begin, yeah.
Yeah, that's where I'd begin.
And then go through the process we already talked about.
Yeah.
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 But, and then kind of do it with people's stuff.
There's an interesting... there's all sorts of wonderful stories in Scripture where I think where theological reflection, I think, goes on is in I think it's Acts 10. Is it Acts 10 where Peter and Cornelius...
Yeah, it's after Saul. It's after Paul converts or becomes a Christian.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
Yes, yeah.
And what's interesting is that Peter's got his theology all worked out.
Yeah. Until he doesn't.
Yeah. And it's like the Spirit actually is running further ahead. In the book of Acts, the Spirit is running far further ahead than what the people of God, the churches. Yeah. It's catch up. So Peter has to really do some hard work because it doesn't work, and he's still struggling when they get to chapter 15. He's in and out, and and Paul challenged him. So what I'm saying is that there's a sense in which what God does, we need to reflect on. Yeah, and that requires interaction and wrestling and a toing and throwing. So there's a dialogical element, I think, in theological reflection. Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. I think this was a good conversation. I didn't know what we were going to talk about, really.
Oh, well, that's good.
But it's turned into something quite good.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Graeme.
Yeah.
I've got a lot more to think about.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Always a lot to think about.
Always a lot to think about.
Yeah.
But I think our time's up now.
Yeah. Cool. Great.
All right.